I am so excited to finally make this video after what has been 8 months of research, questions, doubt, and discovery. It's a weird sort of excitement though, because honestly, I still don't quite know how to feel about it myself. I'm autistic, I guess I can just start by saying it, and it feels good to be able to say with no doubt in my head, with all my sensory experiences and social alienation validated, and it makes me so happy that I can make this video because for the longest time, I was lost in the unknown, thinking that there was something fundamentally very wrong with me. I don't think I ever had the conscious thought when I was young that there was something different or off about me. When you look at pictures of me at a young age, I always seemed like I was a perfect little boy, and even if you were to meet that kid, there wasn't much of a hint to suggest anything otherwise. It turns out there's something called the perfect child mask that's common with people with autism, so apparently even having seemingly too little wrong with you should be a red flag. I've spent some time wondering how it took so long for me to get a diagnosis, and I think that most of it's because of this. That being said, something clearly was off about me because in the 5th grade I was voted out of my entire school the most shy. And I say that it's not really that surprising that I wasn't diagnosed sooner, but at the same time the signs were really there. I was incredibly sensitive. I went to the school nurse just about every day. I ran away from my first day of kindergarten. I was happy to just swing on a playset at recess by myself, far away from everyone else. Not that I was even coordinated enough to play the games the other kids were, and I was way too into Bakugan and Beyblade. I also watched the same movies over and over again. It's a wonder I can't recite Spider-Man 3 by heart. I also wore costumes all the time, almost like I was trying to adapt to my unconscious observation of not fitting in. I still have results from routine screening that my school did, and my results are awful, like bottom 3% nonverbal and bottom 18% on the overall skills. I also had a speech impediment when I was younger, and my reading speed was super slow. Teachers just said I would grow out of it, or that I was just a careful reader, whatever that means, but I don't know, screw me, I guess I can't even not cause problems, right? My accent was also very strange for where I live, probably because I watch British Top Gear way too much, and I still spell things the British way too. Of course, I don't have the best memory of things that happened when I was that age, which it turns out is another autism thing, because we're much more likely to suffer from infantile amnesia, which, by the way, I'm going to be saying it turns out that was an autism thing a lot during this video. As I'm now older, I can look back at so many moments in my life and realize that things were going wrong, but at the time I didn't really know that those things were happening at all. I did know that I was less socially motivated than most people, and I was constantly being called out for not talking or interacting with people and teachers much. Most of the time though, I was just in my own world, not really paying attention to what other people were doing. It's actually just occurring to me now that I didn't think anything was wrong with me, because I thought everything that I was going through was normal, and you might ask, how could I not tell that what I was experiencing wasn't normal? And for that, I have an answer. I've struggled through my life with chronic burnout, and there was a time where I thought those symptoms were from Klein-Levin syndrome, which I've also been diagnosed with, but now I'm not so sure if I ever even had KLS. Of course, now I know that autistic burnout is its own specific thing, and let me tell you, autistic burnout is a real thing and alive and well with me even now. And autistic burnout has kicked my ass my entire life. When I was in school, this would manifest itself and I would end up having terrible attendance. This obviously caused a ton of problems with my parents. I was so exhausted from going to school that I would have complete meltdowns, crying in my room, hiding in the closet, while my parents were trying to drag me off, pressured from the school who was sending letters telling them that I had bad attendance. Those experiences were obviously super traumatic. Not that I blame my parents for that, they just didn't know. I eventually ended up going to online school because of this, not because anybody knew I was autistic, but because of my Klein-Levin syndrome diagnosis. So fortunately, I guess I ended up getting the accommodations that I needed anyway. My most recent spell of it was so bad that I had to make drastic changes to my life. I think what led to the worst of it was my mentality of just stay busy and all your problems would go away, which is a terrible plan for anyone, let alone a person with autism who is trying to bury all their depression and anxiety under more loads of work when they already can't keep up with it. So when I was at my lowest point, I couldn't work at all anymore. It started with just taking a day off to try to recuperate, and when that started to not work anymore, I would take a long weekend, and then when that didn't work anymore, a week or longer. Eventually it didn't matter how long I stayed away, nothing helped, and I was perpetually tired and depressed. So I quit my job. And I'm very fortunate to be in a position to do that, but if I never reached the level of self-understanding that I needed to, then I'm not sure what would have happened to me. I am sure that whatever it was would have been very bad, as you can imagine, from someone who is pretty severely depressed. I'm also particularly reclusive. Even when I'm around people that I like, I often don't feel the desire to engage with them at all. Family doesn't mean much to me either. When I'm at a family member's house or they're at mine, I always find some place to hide away, to be alone with my thoughts or whatever it is I'm into at the time. When I was going to school, I would spend most of my days not saying a word unless I was with the select few who I felt comfortable around. And because of all this, I didn't think I had a particularly large enough sample size of social interactions to really think that I was weird. My friends from middle school are still my only friends now. It's been over a decade and I haven't made a single new friend. Not that even bothers me, which is also a little weird, but whatever. My uncle called me incognito once, and I think that's a pretty apt way to describe me, always almost invisible. And the reason he called me that in the first place was because my parents and I were sitting at a bar when my uncle walked in, and what was probably 10 minutes passed before he even noticed I was there. Also, I would go like entire school years where teachers wouldn't even know my name, like really weird stuff. I was always in the background. So my desire to socialize is pretty low, but also my ability to pick up on social cues is really bad. That means even when I did do something weird, I probably didn't even notice it. I never really thought that I was bullied when I was younger, but looking back at it, it's clear that I was. Although, like I said, I didn't interact with people much, so there weren't so many opportunities to bully me. Neurodivergence is also so widespread in my family, but it's been so normalized because we all just think that our oddities are what everyone does. My mom described it as when everyone comes over and Logan goes away in his room, we just think, oh, that's Logan, he just does that. But so many members of my family have undiagnosed ADHD, and there are definitely some that I suspect have autism too, but it's hard to just bring that up to somebody, especially with the general attitude towards these conditions. Everybody tends to think that neurodiversity and mental health conditions are overblown or an over-exaggeration from a younger generation, but they aren't, and this attitude is just stopping the children of these misinformed people from getting a diagnosis. I heard these things, and they affected me too. I've been full of self-doubt and confusion for a long time because of it. After all, everyone is a little weird, everyone has their own unique problems, and who's to say what's happening to me isn't normal? Maybe I'm not autistic, not depressed, not anxious. Maybe there's nothing wrong with me at all. I had a lot of unanswered questions 8 months ago when I first started learning about autism. I didn't really even have a conception in my head of what autism looks like, which most people do. Of course, most people's view of autism is a nonverbal child with very high support needs, but that's by no means the whole story. I've already talked about some of my autistic traits, but most of those were from childhood. But autism is a lifelong condition. I was born with it and I will have it for the rest of my life. Now these traits have evolved. My hyperfixations are no longer about Bakugan and Beyblade, but are about philosophy and chess and bass and poetry. And I don't really have many meltdowns anymore, but I can become completely shut down, sometimes not able to speak a word if I want to, which can in some cases be even more distressing than a meltdown because all that pain just gets internalized. I can have very little to no facial expression and eye contact. It's strange to me, to say the least. My sensory experiences are as bad as ever, and I'm constantly fidgeting or playing with something with my hands, and embarrassing as it is to admit, I still flap my hands when I get lost in my imagination. All this, and I still didn't have any clue. You have to understand that I'd spent all of my life with autism not even being an option for me, so to suddenly have this thing that started explaining everything in my life, I was a little apprehensive. I was especially apprehensive to tell others about it, not that I didn't try, but always their initial reaction was negative. Most people thought there's no way I could be autistic because I function too well, and I even got the classic, my cousin is autistic and you're nothing like him. No one knew what was going on inside my head though, and if they did, they maybe would have seen things differently. I say maybe because the general population still knows next to nothing about what autism is, and as I said before, that was definitely the camp that I found myself in at the start. I never really thought that there was absolutely no way I could be autistic, but I was so open to a lot of different things at the time to try to explain the cycle of rough situations that I often found myself in. So I explored a lot of different things that I previously had no idea about, like ADHD, OCD, and borderline personality disorder. Eventually I rolled all of these out and focused solely on autism, but the doubt remained in my head for a long time, particularly about ADHD, which my therapist was pretty sure that I had. For some reason, I really didn't want to be diagnosed with ADHD, and I really can't explain why that is, but there was something about it that I found horrifying, and here comes part of the video where I start to share thoughts that I've never shared with anyone else before. I spent a long time feeling like I was somehow less than human, and I went beyond just thinking about it. I did legitimate research into the idea, from reading about Jung's archetypes to try to find something lacking in my psyche, to novels like No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. I was looking for ways to see why I was different in the most destructive ways. I found deep connection to sad, depressed, and awful characters in fiction, people who I felt were destitute of the soul, but it turns out that I was really just identifying with the autistic traits of these characters, who were often self-inserts of the author or someone the author knew, who all had or are speculated to have had undiagnosed autism. So it turns out there kind of was a part of their soul that was missing, a certain understanding of themselves that had for a long time been hidden away, and that's what I was feeling too. None of it made me any less human, I just didn't have the full picture. Once I started to realize this, I came up with traits that I saw in myself and these fictional characters that I thought related to autism, and so I typed up a 6,500 word document about it all, as if that isn't the most autistic thing ever, and I used my own terms for things that I was later validated for, because in research I found that people had already come up with these things that I was writing about, but they just had different names. For example, I came up with hiding and clowning for masking strategies, and those concepts already existed in the autism community as camouflage and compensation. And once I came to terms with the fact that my sensory perception of the world was very different from everyone else's, which was something that I at first denied about myself, I finally lost a lot of doubt about it. The fact that I ever doubted my sensory sensitivities is crazy to me now. I point out every single high-pitched and repetitive noise. The sun just annoys me. I've always hated smelling anything, and I'm the pickiest of eaters. I have had a lot of moments in my life where I just wish I could stop existing, or that I didn't have ears anymore or couldn't see, and what do you know, it turns out that non-existence ideation is very common in autistic people, particularly when they're in burnout. There are actually a lot of things like that that I denied about myself. My initial reaction to most traits that I learned about with autism was that it wasn't like me at all, until I took the time to actually consider what those things meant. Also, learning about alexithymia, which often coincides with autism, put it a lot more into context, and it gave me finally proof that I really didn't know myself at all, at least not as well as I think I did. Even today, though, I still have my doubts, and I debated even saying this, but in an attempt to come as close to the truth as possible, I will. I often worry that my meta-knowledge of things may skew the results. I did so much research into autism, I thought that I might have projected these traits onto myself and that I really wasn't autistic. The idea worried me so much that I completely avoided researching all of the testing methods used in assessments to try to avoid getting misdiagnosed. I think this worked really well because when I went to my assessment, I was rarely asked questions about autism directly. Instead, I had to do things like act out a scene or tell a story based on a list of objects. That being said, whenever I was asked any questions about autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, I knew exactly what the answer was that would lead to a diagnosis. I still tried my best to answer these questions truthfully, but I have the fear that I had some implicit bias to answer a certain way. I mean, I could practically write a dissertation on this by now. I think that these fears are irrational, and imposter syndrome is also very common in autistic people. We worry about things like, am I autistic enough? And do I really deserve the support that I'm getting? I'm still learning to put these irrationalities aside, and if I apply any sort of logical analysis to myself, it still is quite clear that I'm autistic. The results from my assessment corroborate this pretty well, as many of the scores that I received on certain tests were not only high, but high even amongst other autistic people, pointing to the fact that even excluding the answers that I might have given that were biased, I was still very likely to be autistic. And the doctor performing my assessment seemed to act like me being autistic was the most obvious thing they had ever seen. When she revealed to me that I was autistic, she said, "This probably isn't a surprise to you," and I guess it wasn't, but it still was kind of a surprise that she diagnosed me with it. And after waiting over half a year to even get assessed, which is actually a relatively short amount of time compared to how long it usually takes for people to get an appointment, I had one 6-page document stating that I was autistic, which felt like the explanation for my whole life condensed down into 6 pages, which I thought was comically short. And now I have to come to terms with what this means. I can already feel the regression of skills. Trying to do things that I used to do is like trying them for the first time again. I drove to get gas last week, and doing something that used to be second nature like driving felt extremely foreign to me. I'm also worse at social situations than I used to be. In my attempt to unmask and be more like myself, I've inadvertently lost a lot of the strategies that I used previously to fit in, but it's all worth it because my mental health has been slowly becoming not atrocious. And after all this, any sort of improvement feels incredible. Not to say that I'm doing great, but I'm moving in the right direction. I guess you could say I feel alright, but that's about it. It shocked me how much I felt nothing after my diagnosis. And I haven't had a lot of time to process this. It's been a month, but I think that my lack of reaction was more surprising to me than any sort of result from the testing. I guess really nothing's changed. I'm still living my day-to-day life the same. I still spend most of my days enraptured by my special interests. I'm still as autistic as the day I was born, and I feel more than ever that life is still waiting for me. Looking towards the future is just about all that I do these days. My hope is that now that I have this context of a diagnosis, I can do the things in life that I always wanted to but previously had ran into roadblocks when trying before. I want to go back to school. I want to finish my novel, maybe one day publish a poetry collection. I want to make YouTube videos, and maybe one day, maybe form some real kind of deep connection with someone who I'm convinced at this point has to be neurodivergent. All of this started in the first place because a YouTuber that, even before they were diagnosed, I felt a deep connection to, unlike I had ever felt for anybody before, came out as autistic. When I heard about that, I quickly said, "Oh no," and immediately started doing my own research. I know all that sounds very parasocial, and it is, but the amount of resources that are on YouTube that helped me is incredible. I don't think I'm one to peddle a message of self-help, but if you do find that you're having your own questions about autism, or if you're curious just to learn more, I'll link those channels that helped me so much in the description below. And speaking of curiosity, I'm still just as incredibly curious about myself as I've always been, and there's still so much to learn. This diagnosis is anything but an end for me. If anything, it just feels like I'm starting something for the first time, and I hope that those are words that I can live up to. And now, finally, moving on from digging so deep into my past, I can plan for the future. I'm very excited for a trip that I have planned very soon, flying to the other side of the country by myself for the first time. And it all feels so tangibly close now, too. After I had to wait so long in the unknown for my diagnosis, life is now starting to get busy again. Hopefully this time I can actually find fulfillment instead of burning up. But that's about all from me. Not quite sunshine and rainbows, but also not gloom and doom either. This video has done a lot to help me process what's happening, and I hope there's a new video in a much shorter time span than how long it took for this one to come out, but who knows. Until then, see ya.